The bite that shook the station. The diplomatic station Harmony's reach floated above the blue-white world of Asteris Prime like a shining city among the stars. Thousands of vessels arrived and departed from its docks every day, carrying representatives from dozens of species across known space. Today, however, the station buzzed with unusual tension. The Carracks had arrived. For most of the galaxy, the Carracks were the closest thing to living nightmares. Towering, heavily built, and equipped with powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws, they were apex predators from a death world few outsiders dared visit. Although they had been members of the Galactic Assembly for decades, many species still regarded them with suspicion. Even their children inspired fear. Inside the grand reception hall, diplomats gathered beneath glittering crystal lights. Conversations flowed politely, but nervous glances kept drifting toward the Carracks delegation. Human diplomat Daniel Carter noticed it immediately. "They're staring again," he said quietly to his assistant. His assistant nodded. Most species still aren't comfortable around them. Daniel looked across the room. The Carracks representatives stood calmly near the center of the hall, speaking with assembly officials. Despite their intimidating appearance, they seemed perfectly professional. "They're here for peace talks," Daniel said. "Not a hunt." Before his assistant could reply, a sudden alarm sounded. A sharp cry echoed through the chamber. Several heads turned. Then came another shout. "The cub!" Instantly, panic swept across the room. A small Carracks cub burst from a side corridor and sprinted into the reception hall. Though young, it was already the size of a large earth wolf. Dark scales covered its body, and its golden eyes darted wildly from face to face. The cub was terrified. Delegates scattered. Tables overturned. Security officers rushed forward. The frightened young predator skidded across the polished floor and disappeared beneath a banquet table. The hall descended into chaos. "Contain it. Clear the area. Protect the delegates." Daniel watched the scene unfold and frowned. The cub wasn't hunting. It wasn't attacking. It was hiding. He could see the fear in its movements. While security teams formed a perimeter, the cub crouched beneath the table, trembling. A low growl escaped its throat. Every armed officer raised their weapons. Daniel stepped forward. "Wait." Several guards immediately turned toward him. "Ambassador Carter, stay back," one officer warned. "It's scared," Daniel replied. "It's dangerous. So is every frightened creature when it thinks it's trapped." Ignoring the protests around him, Daniel slowly approached the table. The cub's growls intensified. Its eyes locked onto him. Fear radiated from every movement. Daniel stopped a few meters away and knelt. "Easy there," he said softly. The cub flattened itself against the floor. "I know you're scared." The creature didn't understand his words, but his calm tone seemed to reach it. Around the room, hundreds of spectators watched in complete silence. Daniel carefully extended his hand. The cub hesitated. Then instinct took over. With shocking speed, it lunged. Its jaws clamped around Daniel's hand. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Several delegates screamed. Blood dripped onto the polished floor. Weapons were raised instantly. The Carracks representatives froze in horror. For a moment, nobody moved. This was exactly the disaster everyone had feared. A Carracks had attacked a human diplomat. The consequences could be catastrophic. Daniel looked down at the cub. Its teeth remained buried in his hand. Yet behind its aggression, he saw something unexpected. The creature wasn't angry. It was terrified. Its body trembled uncontrollably. Slowly, Daniel lowered himself closer. "It's okay," he whispered. The cub blinked. The hall remained silent. Daniel didn't pull away. He didn't shout. He didn't strike back. Instead, he gently rested his free hand on the creature's shoulder. The cub's growling weakened. "It's okay," Daniel repeated. The young predator slowly released his injured hand. Blood stained Daniel's sleeve. Nobody breathed. The cub stared at him. Then, incredibly, it leaned into his touch. Daniel carefully scratched beneath its jaw. The creature's trembling began to fade. Security officers stood frozen. Diplomats stared in disbelief. Even the Carracks delegates seemed unable to process what they were seeing. The cub that had just bitten a human was now calmly sitting beside him. Daniel smiled softly. "There you go," he said. Across the hall, shock gave way to utter silence. The disaster everyone expected had not happened. No threats, no retaliation, no demands. Only a wounded human comforting the frightened creature that had hurt him. And in that single moment, without anyone realizing it, the course of galactic history began to change. A galaxy awaits retaliation. Within hours, the incident aboard Harmony's Reach had spread far beyond the station. News networks across the galactic assembly replayed the same footage again and again. The frightened Carrick's cub, the bite, the blood on Daniel Carter's hand, and then the part that nobody could understand. The human had comforted the creature. Across hundreds of worlds, citizens watched in disbelief. Many expected humanity to issue an ultimatum. Others feared military mobilization. Some analysts even predicted the collapse of the fragile diplomatic talks between humanity and the Carricks. Instead, nothing happened. No fleets moved. No threats were issued. No sanctions were announced. Human space remained calm. That calmness frightened many species even more. In the assembly chambers, emergency meetings continued day and night. "The humans are planning something," one delegate insisted. "They must be." Another shook her head. "Or perhaps they truly do not view this as an attack." The room fell silent. For many species, the idea was impossible to accept. Predators retaliated when challenged. Prey defended themselves when threatened. That was the way the galaxy worked. Yet humanity seemed to follow entirely different rules. Meanwhile, Daniel Carter sat inside the station's medical wing while a robotic surgeon finished treating his injured hand. The bite had been deep, but not serious. A medical technician sealed the final wound. "You are fortunate," she said. Daniel smiled. The cub was fortunate too. The technician stared at him. Most of the station had been staring at him that way ever since the incident. A notification appeared on his tablet. Another interview request. Then another. And another. He sighed. The media frenzy had become impossible to avoid. Later that day, Daniel stood before dozens of reporters gathered inside the station's press center. Questions erupted immediately. "Ambassador Carter, do you hold the Carricks responsible? Will humanity seek compensation? Do you believe the attack was intentional?" Daniel raised a hand for silence. The room settled. "It wasn't an attack," he said. The reporters exchanged confused looks. The cub was frightened. "It bit you." "Yes." "You were injured." "Yes." "Then how was it not an attack?" Daniel paused. "Have any of you ever seen a frightened child?" No one answered. "They scream. They panic. They sometimes lash out." He folded his hands behind his back. "Fear makes creatures do things they wouldn't normally do." The room became quiet. "The cub wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to protect itself." His answer spread through every major news network within minutes. And the confusion only deepened. On Carrick's Prime, the footage reached High Elder Varric himself. The elderly leader watched silently from his council chamber. When the recording ended, none of the advisors spoke. Finally, one of them broke the silence. "Humans make no sense." Varric slowly nodded. "No, they make more sense than we realized." For generations, the Carricks had been feared. Other species tolerated them, but few trusted them. Their predator instincts made everyone uneasy. Even accidental incidents often created diplomatic crises. Now one of their cubs had bitten a human ambassador, yet the human had shown compassion instead of anger. The concept was almost unbelievable. Meanwhile, the young cub remained isolated inside a secured habitat aboard Harmony's Reach. The handlers had returned it to safety immediately after the incident. But since then, the cub had refused food. It barely moved. It spent most of its time curled into a corner. The station's veterinarians worried its condition was worsening. When Daniel received the report, he frowned. "Has anyone visited it?" "Only handlers," one official answered. "And they say it becomes agitated whenever they approach." Daniel thought for a moment. Then he made a request that shocked everyone. "I'd like to see it." The room erupted with objections. "Absolutely not. It already injured you. The risk is unacceptable." Daniel listened patiently. Then he lifted his bandaged hand. It injured me because it was scared. He looked around the room. If it's still scared, leaving it alone won't help. 2 hours later, after endless debates and security preparations, permission was granted. A team of guards escorted Daniel toward the habitat chamber. Behind reinforced glass, the cub lay motionless. Its golden eyes opened as the door slid aside. The moment it saw Daniel, something changed. The fear vanished. The cub immediately stood. The guards tensed. Weapons remained ready. Slowly, the young Carex approached. Daniel crouched near the entrance. For several seconds, neither moved. Then the cub gently lowered its head against his shoulder. The guards stared in disbelief. Daniel smiled. "Hello again, buddy." The cub made a soft rumbling sound. For the first time since the incident, it seemed calm. And for the first time, many watching through the observation window began to wonder if humanity's greatest strength wasn't its military power at all. Perhaps it was something far rarer. The ability to see fear where everyone else saw an enemy. The truth behind the fear. The video of Daniel Carter sitting beside the young Carex cub spread even faster than the footage of the bite itself. Across the galaxy, billions watched the unlikely pair. The cub, once viewed as a dangerous predator, now rested peacefully beside the human ambassador it had injured. And the more people watched, the more questions they asked. How had a bond formed so quickly? Why did the cub trust him? And what did humanity understand that everyone else seemed to miss? Over the following weeks, Daniel visited the cub every day. The young Carex, officially named Raka, greeted him eagerly each time. What had begun as cautious interaction soon became genuine friendship. Raka followed Daniel around the habitat enclosure, listened attentively when he spoke, and often rested nearby while he worked. The station staff were astonished. Many had expected the relationship to fade. Instead, it grew stronger. Eventually, Daniel was invited to meet several Carex elders who had traveled to Harmony's Reach after hearing about the incident. They gathered in a private conference chamber overlooking the stars. High Elder Varric himself attended. For a long moment, the elders studied Daniel. Then he asked a simple question. "Why?" Daniel smiled. "Why what? Why did you show kindness after being injured?" The room became silent. Daniel considered the question carefully. Because Raka wasn't trying to be cruel. Varric lowered his head slightly. "No one outside our species has ever said that before." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" The elder's expression darkened. "For centuries, the galaxy has feared us." He gestured toward the stars beyond the window. Every accident became proof that we were monsters. Every mistake confirmed their suspicions. The other elders nodded. "Our children grow up sensing that fear." Daniel listened quietly. They see how others react to them. They hear the whispers. They learn very young that the galaxy expects the worst. Suddenly, the bite incident made perfect sense. Raka hadn't attacked because of aggression. He had reacted because he believed everyone around him was afraid. And fear often created the very behavior people feared. Daniel sighed softly. No child should grow up feeling like that. The Carex elders exchanged surprised glances. Most species focused on controlling Carex instincts. Very few focused on understanding them. Soon afterward, a new cultural exchange program began. Human specialists shared knowledge about animal behavior, rehabilitation, and trust building. Many alien representatives attended out of curiosity. They watched recordings of humans working alongside creatures from Earth that were once considered dangerous. Large predators. Rescued wildlife. Animals capable of causing serious harm. Yet humans often cared for them rather than destroying them. The lessons fascinated the galaxy. Species that had always viewed predators as threats began reconsidering old assumptions. For the first time, meaningful conversations began between groups that had spent generations avoiding one another. At the center of it all stood Daniel and Raka. Together, they became symbols of a different future. Not everyone welcomed that future. Some groups had built their influence on fear. If humans and Carex became allies, decades of political power would disappear. One extremist organization saw an opportunity. They secretly infiltrated Harmony's Reach. Their plan was simple. Create another incident. Prove that Carex predators could never be trusted. destroy the growing friendship before it spread any further. One evening, while preparations were underway for a major assembly event, the conspirators acted. They accessed Raka's habitat systems and triggered multiple emergency alarms. Lights flashed red. Warning sirens echoed through the corridors. The young cub panicked instantly. Staff members rushed toward the enclosure. Confusion spread, exactly as the extremists intended. If Raka reacted violently, the footage would be broadcast across the galaxy. Everything Daniel had worked for would collapse. Daniel arrived moments later. The corridor outside the habitat was already crowded with security personnel. Inside, Raka was running in circles, terrified. The alarms continued blaring. Several guards prepared stun weapons. Daniel immediately understood what was happening. Stop! Everyone froze. The guards looked toward him. Those alarms are making it worse. But the cub is out of control. No, Daniel replied firmly. He's scared. The words sounded familiar now. Many officers lowered their weapons. Daniel entered the enclosure alone. The alarms continued flashing. Raka spotted him instantly. The cub's frantic movement slowed. Daniel walked forward calmly. It's okay. Raka approached. It's okay. The young Carix pressed against him. Within seconds, the panic disappeared. The entire observation room fell silent. Security investigators quickly traced the sabotage. The extremists were arrested before they could escape. Evidence of the conspiracy was overwhelming. For many citizens across the galaxy, the incident revealed an uncomfortable truth. The greatest danger had never been the predator cub. It had been those willing to exploit fear for their own gain. A week later, assembly leaders publicly announced the success of the human-Carix partnership. Trade agreements expanded. Scientific cooperation increased. New cultural programs launched across dozens of worlds. And throughout the galaxy, attitudes slowly began to change. Not because of speeches, not because of treaties, but because one frightened cub had bitten a human, and the human had chosen compassion instead of anger. The friendship between Daniel and Raka had become more than a personal bond. It had become proof that understanding could overcome fear. And that proof was beginning to reshape the stars themselves. The cub who changed the galaxy. 1 year later, the image was still famous. No matter where someone traveled in the Galactic Assembly, they would eventually see it. A frightened Carix cub, a wounded human ambassador, a hand resting gently on a trembling shoulder. What many had expected to become the first spark of a devastating war had instead become one of the most important moments in modern galactic history. And the changes that followed were impossible to ignore. Trade routes between humanity and the Carix had expanded dramatically. Joint research programs flourished. Student exchange initiatives connected worlds that had once avoided one another. Even military cooperation had improved. Not because either side feared the other, because they trusted one another. For the first time in centuries, Carix citizens traveled freely through regions where they had once been viewed with suspicion. Fear had not disappeared completely, but it was no longer the galaxy's first response. And much of that change could be traced back to a single cub. Daniel Carter stood inside the Grand Assembly Hall of Harmony's reach once again. The station looked much the same as it had a year earlier. The same towering crystal lights. The same massive observation windows. The same gathering of representatives from hundreds of worlds. But the atmosphere felt entirely different. Today was not a crisis meeting. It was a celebration. Delegations from across known space had arrived to commemorate the first anniversary of the Human-Carix Friendship Accord. Journalists crowded every available platform. Broadcast drones floated overhead. Billions watched from distant worlds. Daniel adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform and looked toward the entrance. A familiar rumbling sound echoed through the chamber. Smiles immediately appeared throughout the audience. Raka had arrived. The cub was no longer a cub. Over the past year, he had grown tremendously. His shoulders now reached nearly to Daniel's chest. Powerful muscles moved beneath dark scales. Sharp claws clicked softly against the polished floor. Yet despite his imposing size, his behavior remained remarkably gentle. As he entered the hall, many delegates greeted him warmly. something unimaginable only a year earlier. Raka calmly approached Daniel and lowered his head. Daniel scratched beneath his jaw. The giant predator responded with a satisfied rumble. The audience laughed softly. The moment was captured by thousands of cameras. The ceremony began shortly afterward. Assembly leaders delivered speeches celebrating the unprecedented cooperation between species. Trade numbers were announced. Scientific breakthroughs were highlighted. Several diplomats described how old hostilities had begun fading because of increased cultural understanding. Then High Elder Varric stepped forward. The chamber immediately fell silent. The elderly Carrick's leader looked across the audience before speaking. For generations, my people carried a burden. His deep voice echoed through the hall. We were feared. We accepted that fear because we believed it could never change. He paused. Then his gaze shifted toward Daniel. We were wrong. The audience listened attentively. A frightened child made a mistake. A human chose compassion. What followed accomplished more than centuries of negotiation. Many delegates nodded. Some even stood in respect. Varric lowered his head toward Daniel. On behalf of the Carrick's people, thank you. The hall erupted in applause. When the applause finally faded, Daniel stepped onto the central platform. For a moment, he simply looked around the enormous chamber. Representatives from countless species watched him. Many remembered exactly where they had been when news of the bite first appeared. Daniel smiled. A year ago, everyone thought they understood what had happened. Soft laughter spread through the crowd. They saw teeth. They saw blood. They saw fear. He paused, and they assumed they were looking at the beginning of a war. The audience grew quiet, but they were wrong. Daniel looked toward Raka. The massive Carricks sat calmly nearby. What they were really seeing was a frightened child. His words echoed throughout the hall. Fear often disguises itself as aggression. It convinces us that others are enemies. It tells us to strike first. He folded his hands behind his back. But true strength isn't measured by how quickly we retaliate. It is measured by how much understanding we can show when retaliation would be easier. The hall remained silent. Every listener focused on his words. If we only respond to fear with fear, nothing changes. But if someone is willing to offer trust first, Daniel smiled. Sometimes history changes. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then the applause began. One delegate stood, then another, then another. Soon the entire chamber rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted several minutes. Raka looked around in confusion before walking toward Daniel. The enormous predator gently rested his head against the human shoulder. The crowd's applause only grew louder. Broadcast cameras captured the moment from every angle. Within hours, the image spread across the galaxy. A human and a predator standing side by side. Not as enemies, not as rivals, but as friends. Years later, students throughout the Galactic Assembly would study the incident in diplomacy courses. They would learn about treaties and agreements. They would learn about political negotiations. But most importantly, they would learn a simple lesson. Sometimes the future changes because someone refuses to let fear make their decisions. A bite that should have started a war instead created peace. A frightened cub became a symbol of unity. And humanity earned the respect of the galaxy not through power, wealth, or military strength, but through the courage to choose compassion when everyone expected revenge. The end. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe to my channel to see more such interesting stories.